The night was quiet, almost too quiet. A young man, just 19, called his parents. His car was stuck in a ditch. All he wanted was help. His voice was calm, clear, almost unnervingly so. He described the roads, the lights in the distance, the fences he crossed. But something was wrong. His directions didn't match reality. Every turn his father took, every search along those dark country roads, led to nothing. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then suddenly a single sharp phrase, "Oh, shit." And just like that, the line went dead. The boy who had just been talking, planning, hoping to reach safety vanished. No footprints, no struggle, no trace, just silence. Where did he go? What happened in those final, terrifying seconds? Tonight, we dive deep into the chilling disappearance of Brandon Swanson, a case that has haunted Minnesota for over a decade. Watch closely. Every detail matters, because some mysteries are never meant to be forgotten. Click play to uncover the mystery that vanished without a single trace. And if you want to help us bring more forgotten stories into the light, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a mystery. It was the night of May 14th, 2008. A Wednesday evening in the small town of Marshall, Minnesota, a place where life moved at a slower pace, where most families knew each other, and where spring nights carried the faint chill of the plains. The fields stretched wide, the highways cut across miles of open land, and silence filled the spaces between towns. For most, it was just another ordinary night. But for one young man, it would be the last night he was ever seen. His name was Brandon Swanson, 19 years old, a college student, a son, a friend. By every account, he was thoughtful, kind, and full of life. His parents, Brian and Annette, would later describe him as bright and determined, someone who knew where he was headed in life. Brandon wasn't just another face in a small town. He was the type of person who left an impression. Brandon had been studying at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby. That spring evening, he had joined friends to celebrate the end of the semester. It was a small get-together, casual and lighthearted. There was no indication that the night would turn tragic. No one could have imagined that hours later, Brandon would vanish without a trace. Before we step into the events of that night, it's important to understand who Brandon was. At 19, he was at the threshold of adulthood. His friends remembered him as easygoing, quick to laugh, and the kind of person who made others feel comfortable. His family described him as reliable, thoughtful, and deeply loved. Brandon had dreams, like any young person his age. He was considering transferring to a 4-year program, exploring possibilities for his future. He had grown up in Marshall, and though the town was small, it was home. It was where his friends were, where his family was rooted, and where he always felt a sense of belonging. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson has since become one of Minnesota's most haunting cold cases, but in the spring of 2008, he was simply a young man looking forward to the next chapter of life. That Wednesday morning, Brandon's day was unremarkable. Classes, routines, and the quiet rhythms of student life. The semester had ended, and for Brandon, the evening was a chance to relax with classmates. He spent the day like so many others, completely unaware that the hours ahead would forever change the lives of his family and his community. As the sun set, Marshall and the surrounding towns slipped into stillness. In rural Minnesota, nights fall quiet. The sky opens up to endless stars, and the blacktop roads stretch out into seeming infinity. The farther one drives from the town center, the darker and lonelier it becomes. It's the kind of landscape where anything can happen unnoticed, where a single wrong turn can feel like stepping off the map. For Brandon, the night started out as ordinary. After leaving the gathering in Canby, he got into his car, a green Chevy Lumina, and began the drive back home. It was a route he knew well, but one that carried him through stretches of open land, gravel roads, and darkened fields. He was expected home before long. His parents would later recall that nothing seemed unusual about his plans. But somewhere along that route, something went wrong. To understand the gravity of what happened, it helps to imagine the setting. Rural Minnesota at night can be unforgiving. Once you leave the glow of a small town, darkness becomes absolute. The roads are narrow and winding, and many are unpaved. The terrain alternates between farmland, ditches, and the Cottonwood River that cuts across the region. In 2008, cell service in these areas was patchy. GPS technology was not as advanced as it is today, and young drivers like Brandon relied mostly on memory and landmarks. One wrong turn could place you miles off course without realizing it. And in the dead of night, those roads all looked the same. This was the world Brandon drove into on May 14th. An ordinary drive home became a labyrinth of uncertainty. Later, investigators would piece together the timeline of that evening. After leaving his friends, Brandon got into his car around midnight. He was alone, sober, and making the familiar trip back toward Marshall. But instead of arriving home, his car veered off course. What happened in those crucial minutes remains a mystery. Did Brandon misjudge a turn? Did he choose a back road, believing it would be a shortcut? Or was it simply a small error, the kind of mistake any driver could make in the dark? Whatever the reason, Brandon's car ended up stuck in a ditch along a gravel road. It wasn't a dramatic crash, no one reported hearing anything, and there was no damage to the vehicle. But the car was immobilized, and with fields stretching endlessly around him, Brandon found himself stranded in the night. At 12:30 a.m., Brandon did what most of us would do. He reached for his phone and called his parents. That single decision would mark the beginning of one of the most puzzling missing person cases in Minnesota history. When Brandon's parents answered, they were surprised. Brandon rarely needed help, and he wasn't the type to panic. He explained calmly that his car had slid into a ditch and he needed a ride home. From his voice, there was no sign of fear or alarm. He didn't sound distressed, just inconvenienced. Brian and Annette agreed to come get him. Brandon described his location as being near the town of Lind, a small community southwest of Marshall. It was only a short drive from their home. His parents set out immediately, certain that within minutes they'd find their son and bring him safely home. But as they drove, something strange happened. The roads Brandon had described didn't look the way his parents expected. They drove toward Lind, scanning every ditch and roadside, but saw no sign of their son's green Chevy Lumina. Brandon stayed on the phone, directing them, certain he knew where he was. His parents tried to follow his instructions, but the roads twisted and branched, and every turn seemed to lead them farther from him. For nearly 45 minutes, the family remained on the phone, trying to connect their separate worlds. Brandon stranded in the dark, his parents circling through country roads. He flicked his headlights on and off, hoping they would see him in the distance. But the darkness swallowed everything. His lights were invisible. It was as though Brandon was in a different world entirely. Throughout it all, Brandon's voice remained steady. He wasn't panicking, and he wasn't afraid. He laughed at times, brushing off the inconvenience of the situation. He reassured his parents that everything would be fine. They would find him soon enough, he believed. But as the minutes turned to hours, unease began to grow. The longer they searched without finding him, the stranger the situation seemed. How could they be in the same general area and not cross paths? How could headlights not pierce the same night sky? The clock pushed past 1:30 a.m. Brandon, still calm, suggested that maybe it would be easier if he walked toward the lights of Lind. He believed he knew the direction, and he told his father he could meet him on the road. So Brandon left his car behind and stepped into the night. Imagine the scene. A 19-year-old, phone pressed to his ear, walking alone down a gravel road in rural Minnesota. Around him, fields stretched endlessly, broken only by fences and the occasional cluster of trees. The night air was cool, the ground uneven. His only connection to safety was the voice of his father on the other end of the line. For nearly 47 minutes, Brandon and his father remained in constant contact. Brandon described the roads he walked, the fences he crossed, and the lights he believed were from the town. His father listened, trying to match his son's descriptions to the map in his head. But the geography didn't line up. Every time Brian thought he was closing in, Brandon's description pulled him farther away. It was as if the two men were in overlapping but separate landscapes, unable to bridge the distance. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the call abruptly ended. Brandon's last words were clear and sudden. "Oh shit." The line went silent. Brian tried calling back immediately, but the phone rang without answer. Again and again, he dialed, but Brandon never picked up. It was as though his son had vanished in mid-sentence. For Brandon's parents, the reality set in quickly. Something had gone terribly wrong. They had been on the phone with their son for nearly 2 hours, guiding, searching, listening. And then, in an instant, he was gone. The drive home that night was filled with dread. The roads they retraced looked emptier than ever. His parents could not have known then that they had just witnessed the final moments of contact with their son, a disappearance that remains unsolved to this day. The mystery of Brandon Swanson begins here, on a quiet road in rural Minnesota, on a night that should have ended with a simple ride home, and with a 19-year-old whose voice faded into silence. And it all began with what seemed like the most ordinary of nights. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson is remembered today as one of the most haunting cold cases in Minnesota history. But at its heart, the case is not defined by the silence of the night. It is defined by a voice. For nearly 2 hours in the early morning of May 15th, 2008, Brandon was not alone. He was in contact with the one person who wanted nothing more than to bring him safely home, his father, Brian. This call, stretching from 12:30 a.m. until 2:17 a.m., remains one of the most extraordinary and chilling elements of the case. It is rare in missing persons investigations to have such a detailed account of someone's final known moments, spoken in their own voice, step by step. Brandon's calmness, his clarity, and his sudden vanishing into silence have left investigators, his family, and the public grappling with the same question for over a decade. What happened during that call? When Brandon first dialed his parents' number, it was just after 12:30 a.m. For Brian and Annette Swanson, the ringing phone was unexpected but not alarming. Brandon often drove late at night, and he was a capable, self-reliant young man. But on this night, his voice came through the line asking for help. He explained that his car had gone off the road and was stuck in a ditch. He wasn't injured. He wasn't panicked. He simply needed a ride. Brandon believed he was near Lind, a small town just 7 miles southwest of Marshall. The request was simple. His parents reassured him that they'd be there soon, and they climbed into their pickup truck to go get their son. What they couldn't have known was that this phone call would lead them not toward their son, but into one of the most baffling nights of their lives. As the Swansons drove toward Lind, Brandon stayed on the phone, calmly giving directions. He told them where he thought he was, what roads he believed he had taken, and which landmarks he saw nearby. But almost immediately, things didn't add up. When his parents reached the area he described, there was no sign of him. They scanned the shoulders of the road, expecting to see headlights glinting in the ditch. There was nothing. They turned around, retraced their path, and drove slower this time. Still nothing. Brandon flicked his headlights on and off, hoping his parents would catch the flash in the distance. But the night swallowed the light. For Brian and Annette, confusion set in. They were both lifelong residents of the area. They knew the roads around Lindwell. If Brandon was where he thought he was, they should have been able to find him quickly. But he wasn't there. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the disconnect between Brandon's descriptions and his parents' search became increasingly frustrating. Brandon insisted he was near Lind. His parents drove every road in and out of town, circling like moths drawn to a light they could never find. They passed farms, gravel roads, and endless fields, but there was no sign of the Chevy Lumina. It was as though Brandon had fallen into a pocket of the countryside that didn't exist on their map. Some listeners of this story might ask, was Brandon intoxicated? Had he been drinking at the party? And could that explain the confusion? Investigators addressed this question early on. His friends later reported that while Brandon had consumed some alcohol that night, he had not been drinking heavily. He did not appear impaired when he left the gathering. And throughout the nearly 2-hour phone call, his speech was clear, his thinking logical, and his directions confident. There was no indication of slurred words, no signs of disorientation. The problem wasn't Brandon's state of mind. The problem was geography. One of the most haunting details of this case is how confident Brandon was in his knowledge of his surroundings. He wasn't a stranger to country roads. He had grown up in the area, driven those routes countless times, and had a good sense of direction. That night, he firmly believed he was near Lind. He described lights in the distance that he thought belonged to the small town. He walked toward them, telling his father about fences he crossed and gravel roads he followed. But the reality, revealed later by cell phone records, was very different. Brandon wasn't near Lind at all. His car would eventually be found in a ditch near Taunton, almost 25 miles away, in the opposite direction. How could a young man who knew the area so well be so mistaken about his location? This question remains one of the central mysteries of the case. For Brandon Swanson, the call was both a lifeline and a torment. He remained on the phone with his son, listening carefully, trying to match Brandon's descriptions to his own mental map of the county roads. The minutes ticked by. Midnight turned to 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock crept toward 2. Every so often, Brandon would remark casually about his surroundings. He wasn't panicking. He didn't sound lost. He believed that any minute now, his father's headlights would crest the hill and they'd reunite. For Brian, the helplessness was overwhelming. He was doing everything a father could do, driving, searching, following instructions, staying connected by phone. But no matter what he tried, he could not bridge the gap between his son's world and his own. Eventually, Brandon made a decision. Frustrated by the lack of progress, he told his father he would leave his car behind and walk toward the lights he saw in the distance. He believed they belonged to Lind, and he was certain he could reach the town on foot. Brian tried to guide him as best as he could. He drove along the roads near Lind, while Brandon narrated his walk. The fences he crossed, the gravel roads beneath his feet, the lights that seemed to draw closer and then farther away. It was a surreal situation, father and son connected by voice, moving separately through the night, each certain they were heading toward each other. But the truth was cruel. Brandon wasn't walking toward Lind at all. He was miles away, walking into a darkness that no one has been able to fully explain. At 2:17 a.m., after nearly 2 hours of conversation, Brandon's tone suddenly changed. He was mid-sentence when he exclaimed, "Oh shit." Then the call went silent. Brian froze. He shouted his son's name into the phone, but there was no response. The line remained open for a moment, then disconnected. Brian immediately called back. The phone rang, but Brandon never answered. He called again, and again. Each time, the call went unanswered. In that instant, Brian knew something was terribly wrong. Theories abound about what could have triggered Brandon's final words. Some believe he may have slipped into the nearby Yellow Medicine River, his last words a reaction to losing his footing. Others suggest he may have stumbled on uneven ground, fallen into a ditch, or encountered something unexpected in the night. But there was no scream, no prolonged sound of struggle, just 2 words and then silence. For his parents, that moment is etched permanently in their memory. They were so close, connected to their son until the very last second, powerless to prevent whatever took him away. When the line went dead, Brian and Annette drove frantically through the countryside, hoping to spot their son walking along the road. They called repeatedly, praying he would pick up, but Brandon never answered. As dawn approached, they realized the situation was far beyond their control. They contacted law enforcement, reporting their son missing. But what should have been the start of an urgent search quickly became another painful layer of the mystery. Because Brandon was 19 years old, legally an adult, the initial response was hesitant. Authorities suggested he may have simply chosen to stay out all night, or that he would return in the morning. His parents knew better. They had been on the phone with him when he vanished. They knew something had gone wrong. But convincing law enforcement would take time. And in missing person cases, time is everything. Today, the nearly 2-hour call between Brandon and his father stands as one of the most unique and heartbreaking elements of the case. It provides more detail than most disappearances ever yield, and yet it answers almost nothing. We know Brandon was calm. We know he believed he was near land. We know he walked through the night, narrating his journey, until he suddenly vanished. But what happened in those final moments remains a void. For his parents, that phone call is both a comfort and a curse. Comfort, because they were with their son in his last known moments, hearing his voice, guiding him. A curse, because they were so close to saving him and yet could do nothing. The call is not just a detail of the case, it is the case. It is the bridge between Brandon's life and his disappearance. It is the sound of a young man fading into history, leaving behind only questions. By the early hours of May 15th, 2008, the reality of Brandon Swanson's disappearance began to sink in. The call had ended abruptly, leaving his parents, Brian and Annette, in the dark, literally and metaphorically. The phone was silent. Their son, their 19-year-old child, had vanished from the rural roads of Minnesota, and no one knew where he was. What followed was a night, and then a day, that would stretch into a search spanning miles of farmland, gravel roads, rivers, and ditches. It was a search that would test the patience, resilience, and hope of Brandon's family, friends, and the local community. And it was a search that, for all its thoroughness, would ultimately leave more questions than answers. Immediately after the call ended, Brian and Annette set out on the roads themselves. They drove back and forth, scanning every shoulder, every ditch, every field. Brandon had been walking. Perhaps he was visible from a distance. Perhaps a flashlight or a pair of headlights would catch their attention. They drove slowly, calling his name, hoping for a sign, a sound, a movement. Hours passed with no response. The quiet of the night stretched around them. The road seemed endless. Every turn, every hill, every bend in the road brought the cruel reminder that Brandon was not there. By the time dawn approached, it was clear that the search needed to be expanded. Brandon wasn't simply late or lost. He was missing. Brandon was 19, and while adults have the legal right to leave home, his parents knew the difference between a young adult choosing to stay out and one who had genuinely disappeared. Brian and Annette contacted the local authorities to report him missing. The first reports were met with the standard protocols of missing persons cases. Law enforcement dispatched officers to check likely locations: Brandon's home, the roads he might have traveled, and nearby towns. But early investigations were complicated by geography and timing. Brandon's last call placed him near Lind, yet cell tower records would later reveal discrepancies. The exact location of his disappearance was uncertain, making the search area vast. And in the early hours, with Brandon's car abandoned somewhere unknown, the task seemed almost impossible. As news spread, friends and neighbors joined the search. Local residents, familiar with the rural roads and terrain, volunteered to drive in shifts, combing ditches, scanning fields, and calling out Brandon's name. The community effort was immense, fueled by concern, hope, and the fear that every minute without answers increased the risk of tragedy. High school classmates, neighbors, and local farmers became part of the effort. The area's geography, with its winding gravel roads, hidden ditches, and dense farmland, required people who knew the land intimately. Residents moved in organized groups, systematically covering one road at a time. As daylight broke, the police formalized their investigation. Officers from multiple jurisdictions were involved: the Marshall Police Department, Lyon County Sheriff's Office, and state authorities. Search and rescue protocols were activated. Plans were drawn to locate Brandon's vehicle, understand his likely movements, and track him along any possible path from the ditch. Investigators also collected statements from Brandon's friends, confirming his activities at the party, his demeanor, and the time he left. They gathered information about the roads he may have taken and his familiarity with the area. The challenge was enormous. Rural Minnesota's roads form a complex web. One gravel road connects to another, and many are unmarked. Brandon could have walked in any direction, and cell phone coverage in 2008 was inconsistent, leaving gaps in the timeline. The first daylight hours were critical. Volunteers spread across the area where Brandon was last believed to be. Horseshoe-shaped drives around Lind, Marshall, and nearby towns formed concentric rings of hope. Every ditch, every pond, every cluster of trees was scoured. Dogs were brought in. K-9 units trained to track human scent attempted to follow any trail Brandon may have left. Teams combed riversides and farmland, yet no definitive trace emerged. The searchers faced the cruel reality that visibility, while improved in daylight, was still limited by the vastness of the rural landscape. Brandon's car was nowhere to be found. His father's and neighbors' searches had not revealed even a hint of its location. And so, the uncertainty deepened. As the hours progressed, coordination became essential. Command centers were established, logs were kept, and communication between teams was maintained by radio. Each volunteer and officer was assigned sectors to cover, but the expansive search area made coverage incomplete. Maps were drawn, checked, and redrawn. Each road, ditch, and river crossing was documented. Brandon's known path from the party to the point where he disappeared guided the search, but even the best mapping could not resolve the gap between his believed location near Lind and where his car was later found near Taunton, roughly 25 miles away. The search had a ripple effect across the town. Friends, classmates, and neighbors followed updates closely, checking in on progress. Rumors began to circulate, some accurate, others speculative. Every report of a green Chevy Lumina spotted on a side road or field raised hope, only to be followed by disappointment when no trace of Brandon was found. Parents worried for their children. Townspeople worried for their neighbors. And all the while, the search continued, organized yet desperate, methodical yet haunted by uncertainty. As the day wore on, search areas expanded. Helicopters were considered, though limited in availability and effectiveness given the rural terrain and dense farmland. Volunteers continued to canvass roads, checking for tracks in muddy fields, footprints in soft soil, or disturbed vegetation that might indicate Brandon's path. Law enforcement coordinated with local media, sharing descriptions and updates. The hope was to enlist a wider net. Perhaps someone driving through the area would spot Brandon or see his car abandoned. Flyers were printed, notices were posted, and the community's eyes were on every road. Despite the expansion, no substantial leads emerged. Brandon's absence was a growing concern. He was a healthy, capable young man, but he was vulnerable in the open night, walking along roads and through fields alone. Brandon's car, a green Chevy Lumina, remained undiscovered for several days. It was later found along a rural road near Taunton, Minnesota, far from where Brandon had claimed to be. Investigators noted that the ditch where the car had been abandoned was shallow, with no obvious signs of struggle or accident. The car's location introduced a new set of questions. How did Brandon misjudge his location by so many miles? How could a young man familiar with the area become so disoriented? And what, if anything, might this suggest about the events that led to his disappearance? By the second day, theories began circulating among investigators and the community. Some suggested Brandon had become confused and wandered away from his vehicle. Others feared foul play, though there was no direct evidence pointing to abduction. Some considered natural hazards, rivers, ditches, and uneven terrain that could have caused injury or worse. Yet no matter the theory, the search remained the priority. Every possibility was treated seriously. Every area, no matter how remote, was checked. Every detail mattered. The Yellow Medicine River and surrounding waterways became a focus. Investigators considered the possibility of drowning, given the proximity of the river to Brandon's believed location. Boats, sonar equipment, and divers were brought in to search areas where a young man might have fallen or been carried downstream. Even in water searches, the results were inconclusive. Nothing confirmed Brandon's presence in the rivers. Every missed sighting, every untracked footprint, increased the tension and despair among his family and community. Throughout the search, Brandon's parents remained involved, combing roads themselves even as law enforcement coordinated larger efforts. Their knowledge of local roads and landmarks was invaluable, but it could not compensate for the challenges posed by rural Minnesota at night and the miles separating Brandon's actual and perceived locations. Friends and relatives joined, forming informal teams to check areas that official units could not reach immediately. Tireless, they worked through exhaustion, fueled by hope, fear, and the desperate need for answers. Cell phone records later provided crucial, though incomplete, information. Investigators traced Brandon's call patterns, determining which towers connected to his phone during the final hours. These records helped narrow down search areas, but also deepen the mystery. Brandon had believed he was near Lind, yet the towers suggested he was much farther west, closer to Taunton. Technology provided clarity, but also underscored the confusion. It painted a picture of a young man misoriented in familiar surroundings, a haunting contradiction that would perplex authorities for years. Search efforts continued through the day, with volunteers, friends, and law enforcement combing fields, roads, and riverbanks. Every sighting, every clue, raised hope, only to be dashed when no further evidence appeared. The town of Marshall and surrounding communities became a patchwork of search parties, each covering miles of territory, each holding onto the hope that Brandon would be found safe. By the evening of May 15th, exhaustion set in. Yet despite fatigue, the search never stopped. Brandon's disappearance had become the center of a collective effort, an ordeal that united a town in grief, fear, and hope. As news of Brandon's disappearance spread, attention extended beyond Minnesota. National outlets picked up the story, highlighting the unusual circumstances of the final call and the extensive search efforts. Brandon's story became emblematic of missing person cases in rural areas, where even those familiar with the terrain can become disoriented, and where time is critical in locating someone before tragedy strikes. Over the following days, search efforts expanded, incorporating advanced technology, aerial searches, and volunteers from neighboring counties. Ditches, roads, rivers, and forests were examined repeatedly. Yet despite these efforts, Brandon remained missing. The search for Brandon Swanson is remembered not for its success, but for its extraordinary lengths. Friends, family, volunteers, and law enforcement worked tirelessly, combing every corner of southwestern Minnesota in the hope of finding him. And yet, despite every effort, the young man who vanished on May 14, 2008, was never recovered. For Brian and Annette Swanson, the search became a personal mission. They continued to coordinate with law enforcement, educate volunteers on the landscape, and maintain public awareness of their son's disappearance. The hours of that first night, the long drives across country roads, and the desperate attempts to find him in the dark became a defining experience, one marked by determination, hope, and heartbreak. Their efforts laid the foundation for future investigations and reminded the public that in missing person cases, family involvement is often as critical as law enforcement resources. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson is a case defined by its unanswered questions. For years, investigators, family members, and the public have tried to make sense of the events of May 14th and 15th, 2008. The search, the calls, the geography, and the final moments of contact have spawned a web of theories, some grounded in evidence, others speculative. But every theory carries with it a haunting possibility that a young man, full of life, could vanish from the rural landscape of Minnesota without a trace. In this act, we examine the theories that have emerged over the years. Each offers insight, each presents challenges, and each underscores the enduring mystery of Brandon Swanson's disappearance. The most immediate explanation is simple, yet unsettling. Brandon became lost or disoriented and suffered an accident. He was walking alone at night on rural roads, across ditches, and near rivers. The terrain is uneven, the darkness absolute, and the weather in May can be unpredictable. Investigators and experts often emphasize the danger inherent in rural night walks. A young man walking along unlit gravel roads is vulnerable to slips, falls, and accidents. Brandon could have fallen into a ditch, wandered into a river, or become trapped in dense vegetation. The Yellow Medicine River, which runs through the area, is a particular focus. Rivers in Minnesota can have deceptively strong currents, especially at night. Someone who falls in might struggle to survive or be carried downstream. The fact that Brandon's car was abandoned far from where he believed he was reinforces the idea that misorientation may have played a role. Supporters of this theory point to the calmness of Brandon's voice during the phone call. He appeared aware of his surroundings, able to navigate roads and describe landmarks. Yet even those familiar with an area can misjudge distances or directions, particularly in the dark. Another possibility, and one that cannot be dismissed, is foul play. Investigators considered the potential that Brandon may have encountered someone with harmful intent during his walk. Minnesota, while generally safe, is not immune to violent crime. Random encounters with strangers, while statistically rare, are not impossible. Some theories suggest that someone may have been watching the roads, waiting for a vulnerable person. Others consider the possibility of opportunistic crime, a person taking advantage of Brandon's isolation in the early morning hours. There is no direct evidence to support foul play in Brandon's case. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no forensic traces. But the very lack of evidence has fueled speculation. The sudden end of the phone call, marked by Brandon's last words, "Oh shit," leaves room for uncertainty. Some have suggested that whatever caused his disappearance could have happened in a moment, leaving no trace. A less widely accepted theory is that Brandon chose to disappear intentionally. Some argue that young adults, under stress or experiencing personal crises, occasionally vanish without warning. However, evidence contradicts this possibility. Brandon had no history of running away. He was in contact with his parents throughout the final hours, showing calm, rational behavior. He was planning to continue college, and there were no indications of fear or distress unrelated to his car being stuck. His sudden disappearance does not fit the behavioral profile of a voluntary runaway. Still, some theorists entertain the idea, citing the distance between Brandon's perceived location and where his car was later found. Miscommunication about roads could suggest an attempt to mislead, though most investigators find this unlikely. Rural Minnesota nights can be deceptively cold, even in May. Brandon left his vehicle in the early hours of the morning, walking alone through fields and along gravel roads. Exposure to low temperatures, wind, and wet conditions could have led to hypothermia. Hypothermia can impair judgment and perception, making a person walk in circles, misjudge distances, or fail to recognize hazards. It can also render someone unable to call for help or continue moving. Investigators have considered this possibility extensively, particularly given Brandon's calm demeanor until the final moments of the call. His behavior may have been rational initially, but hypothermia can develop gradually, eroding coordination and cognitive function. This theory aligns with the absence of evidence. Someone who succumbs to hypothermia may remain hidden in dense vegetation, ditches, or remote areas, making discovery difficult even during extensive searches. Though less widely discussed, some experts consider the possibility of an encounter with wildlife. Rural Minnesota is home to coyotes, foxes, and other animals that could pose a threat to a lone person walking at night. While an animal attack is statistically improbable, it cannot be fully ruled out. An attack could have incapacitated Brandon, leading to further exposure, injury, or movement away from the road. The lack of any physical evidence makes this theory speculative, yet it highlights the vulnerability of anyone walking alone in remote areas. Brandon's choices during the call provide crucial insight. He opted to leave his vehicle and walk toward what he believed were the lights of land. He described his surroundings clearly, narrating fences, roads, and ditches. His reasoning appeared logical. He was confident in his sense of direction and in his ability to meet his father. Yet the reality of his location was drastically different. His car, found near Taunton, was miles from land. Investigators emphasize that even experienced drivers and walkers can misjudge distances in unfamiliar or poorly lit terrain. Minor errors can compound quickly, turning a familiar area into a maze of uncertainty. Some theorists suggest that Brandon's sense of direction may have been impaired not by alcohol or drugs. He was sober enough to communicate clearly, but by the stress of being stranded and the psychological pressure of guiding his parents over the phone in a dark, expansive landscape. Cell phone records have been critical in reconstructing the events of that night. Brandon's call connected to towers that placed him in locations inconsistent with what he believed. Investigators have used this information to estimate his movements and refine search areas. However, cell tower data in 2008 was not precise. Signals can jump between towers, especially in rural areas. This introduces uncertainty, complicating efforts to determine Brandon's exact location during the final hours of the call. Despite these limitations, the data confirms one fact: Brandon was disoriented. His perception of distance and direction did not match reality, which helps explain how he could walk for nearly 2 hours and yet remain undetected in an area extensively searched. Search and rescue professionals have weighed in on Brandon's disappearance. They note several factors that increase risk in such cases: darkness, isolation, misjudged terrain, and the psychological stress of being stranded. Even a small misstep can have catastrophic consequences. Behavioral analysts have also studied Brandon's actions. They emphasize his rationality, his calm communication, and his logical problem-solving during the call. These traits suggest that his disappearance was unlikely voluntary. Rather, they indicate that environmental factors, terrain, darkness, and distance, played a significant role. Despite extensive community and law enforcement efforts, the search was limited by several factors. Geography. Rural Minnesota is expansive, with countless gravel roads, fields, and waterways. Time of day. Night searches are inherently less effective, and Brandon disappeared in the early morning hours. Technology. In 2008, GPS and cell tower data were less precise than today. Physical obstacles, ditches, rivers, and vegetation complicated tracking efforts. These limitations explain, in part, why Brandon was never located. Even when searched extensively, vast rural areas can conceal evidence of a person's passage, especially if environmental conditions obscure tracks or signs. Brandon Swanson's disappearance defies conventional explanation. He was sober, rational, and communicating with someone who could help him. His car was intact, suggesting no dramatic accident. There was no evidence of foul play, yet he vanished into an area that had been intensively searched. Investigators point to the combination of disorientation, darkness, and rural geography as the most likely explanation. But the lack of physical evidence leaves room for doubt. Every theory carries uncertainty. Every scenario is incomplete. This is why the case continues to fascinate and haunt. It is a study in vulnerability, misfortune, and the unpredictability of rural landscapes. It is a reminder that even small errors, compounded by environment and circumstance, can lead to outcomes that seem impossible to reconcile. Brandon's story has captured the attention of the public and media alike. Forums, podcasts, and websites devoted to missing person cases frequently discuss the case, analyzing details of the phone call, his reported location, and the search efforts. Speculation ranges widely. Some emphasize misadventure, while others fear foul play. Amateur investigators and online sleuths debate every detail: the tone of Brandon's voice, the distance to his car, and the layout of rural roads. Yet amidst speculation, the facts remain the same. Brandon disappeared. His fate is unknown, and the theories, no matter how compelling, cannot provide closure. Theories about Brandon Swanson's disappearance are numerous, but none are definitive. Each has supporting evidence, and each has limitations. His calmness, his rationality, his familiarity with the area all suggest a disappearance caused by misadventure. Yet the absence of physical evidence, the sudden end of the call, and the car's distant location leave room for doubt. Ultimately, the case remains a chilling illustration of uncertainty. It demonstrates how a young man, confident and rational, can disappear in plain sight, across roads he knew, while guiding his father over the phone, and yet remain undetectable in a landscape that had been scoured by dozens of searchers. Brandon Swanson's disappearance has left a mark far beyond the quiet roads of southwestern Minnesota. Over 15 years have passed since that night, yet the questions remain unanswered and unresolved. The story of a 19-year-old vanishing into darkness continues to resonate, haunting those who knew him, those who investigated him, and countless others who have followed his story from afar. The legacy of Brandon's disappearance is not measured solely by the mystery itself, but by the ripples it created in the lives of his family, in the practices of law enforcement, and in the ongoing awareness of the vulnerability of young adults in rural environments. For Brian and Annette Swanson, the disappearance of their son is not a chapter they can close. Every anniversary, every milestone, every quiet evening brings the reminder of what was lost. They continue to search for answers, advocating for missing persons cases and speaking publicly about their experience. Their resilience has inspired families across the country, demonstrating the endurance of hope in the face of uncertainty. While the search may have been extensive and the investigations thorough, it is the parents' unwavering commitment to their son that defines much of the ongoing legacy. They remind us that even when evidence runs cold, the human heart does not. The disappearance also shaped the surrounding communities. Friends, neighbors, and volunteers who participated in the search were forever impacted by the experience. The event galvanized a sense of collective responsibility, showing how ordinary citizens can respond in extraordinary ways when someone is in need. The story of Brandon Swanson is a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly normalcy can be disrupted, how fragile life can be, and how vital vigilance is in rural and isolated areas. Communities learn to act swiftly, to coordinate with authorities, and to pay attention to the small signs that can mean the difference between safety and tragedy. Brandon's case also influenced investigative practices. The combination of the phone call, cell tower data, and extensive search efforts highlighted both the strengths and limitations of 2008-era technology. Law enforcement agencies have since adopted more sophisticated tools, advanced GPS tracking, drone surveillance, improved K-9 deployment, and refined missing person protocols. While these advancements may not have prevented Brandon's disappearance, they have shaped how similar cases are approached, emphasizing speed, coordination, and the integration of technology. Nationally, Brandon's disappearance remains a reference point in discussions about missing persons, particularly in rural settings. True crime enthusiasts, podcasters, and online forums frequently analyze the details: the last phone call, the abandoned car, and the dissonance between his perceived and actual location. The case is emblematic of unsolved disappearances, illustrating the complexity of locating someone in open rural areas and the importance of immediate, coordinated response. It serves as a reminder that missing person cases are rarely straightforward. Each one requires attention, analysis, and, above all, urgency. Though the years have passed, Brandon Swanson has not been forgotten. Investigators continue to monitor leads, review historical data, and explore avenues that may provide closure. For his family, the possibility of resolution, whether finding Brandon or understanding what happened, remains a guiding principle. Every tip, every analysis, every discussion about the case carries significance. And even in the absence of a definitive conclusion, the effort itself represents love, dedication, and the refusal to let a story fade into obscurity. Brandon's disappearance offers lessons that extend beyond this single story. Awareness of surroundings. Even familiar areas can become disorienting at night. The importance of immediate reporting. Every hour counts in a missing persons investigation. The power of community. Coordinated searches by neighbors and volunteers can make a difference, even if results are uncertain. Technological reliance and limitation. Cell phone towers, GPS, and call data are valuable, yet incomplete tools. The human element, communication, calm reasoning, and family involvement are irreplaceable in guiding search efforts. These lessons continue to inform families, investigators, and communities facing similar circumstances, emphasizing vigilance, care, and preparation. Brandon Swanson's story is more than a mystery. It is a reflection on the unpredictability of life, the vulnerabilities inherent in isolation, and the enduring power of hope. His family's efforts, the community's response, and the ongoing discussions around the case ensure that Brandon is not forgotten. His voice, captured during that final call, echoes across time, a reminder of a young man whose life was cut short not in violence, but in mystery. Through remembrance, advocacy, and continued awareness, Brandon's legacy continues to influence the way missing person cases are approached, how families are supported, and how communities respond. Brandon Swanson may never be found. His disappearance may remain one of Minnesota's most perplexing mysteries. But every one of us can take action to prevent future tragedies. If you have information about Brandon or his disappearance, even the smallest detail, it could be crucial. Reach out to local authorities or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Support organizations dedicated to missing persons and cold cases. Share knowledge, raise awareness, and participate in efforts that help families find closure. And remember, every missing person has a story. Every family needs a voice. By staying vigilant, engaged, and compassionate, we honor Brandon and countless others whose lives hang in uncertainty. Brandon Swanson may have vanished into the night, but his story continues to shine a light on the roads, the rivers, and the hearts of those who refuse to forget. Let his story be a reminder. Vigilance saves lives, hope sustains families, and every effort counts.